Sarah Nicole Henderson. In November 2017, authorities in Maybank, Texas, responded to a 911 call, reporting a shooting inside a family home in Henderson County. When deputies arrived, they found two young girls inside the residence. 7-year-old Kay Danielle Henderson and 5-year-old Kenley Elizabeth Pallett had both been shot. They were located in their beds, where they had been sleeping. Emergency responders confirmed both children were deceased at the scene. The shooter was identified as their mother, Sarah Nicole Henderson. The investigation immediately focused on the events of that night. Earlier in the evening, deputies had already visited the home. A welfare check had been requested due to concerns about Henderson's behavior. During that visit, no crime was identified. Deputies left the residence after speaking with the family. Several hours later, the shootings occurred. According to investigators, Henderson retrieved a .380 caliber pistol. She entered the room where the children were sleeping. Both girls were shot at close range. Her husband, Jacob Henderson, was in the home at the time. Jacob Henderson told investigators he was awakened by gunfire. He ran toward the bedroom and confronted his wife. A struggle followed as he fought to take the gun away. He successfully disarmed her. Immediately afterward, he called 911. Investigators noted his actions likely prevented further harm. Sarah Henderson did not flee the scene. She remained inside the home when deputies arrived. She was taken into custody without resistance. Forensic evidence confirmed the sequence of events. Medical examiners determined both children died from gunshot wounds. The wounds were consistent with shots fired while the victims were lying down. There were no signs of defensive injuries. Ballistics testing matched the bullets to the recovered pistol. The firearm had been legally owned by the family. Bloodstain patterns supported the accounts given by Jacob Henderson. There was no evidence of additional shooters. The manner of death for both girls was ruled homicide. As detectives examined motive and background, a mental health crisis emerged. Records indicated Sarah Henderson had been experiencing severe paranoia. Family members reported escalating fear and irrational beliefs. Investigators learned she believed external forces were threatening her children. Witnesses described her as increasingly withdrawn and agitated. On the night of the welfare check, she reportedly expressed intense anxiety. Despite those concerns, no involuntary commitment occurred. Prosecutors later argued the killings were driven by delusional thinking. However, they maintained she understood the nature of her actions. The gap between the welfare check and the shootings became a key issue. It raised questions about missed intervention opportunities. Digital and communication evidence supported the timeline. 9/11 recordings captured Jacob Henderson's call immediately after the struggle. Dispatch logs confirmed the earlier welfare check that evening. There were no threatening messages or external communications driving the act. Phone data placed all parties inside the home during the shootings. Investigators found no evidence of planning beyond that night. The focus remained on Henderson's mental state and access to the weapon. The legal proceedings reflected the gravity of the case. Sarah Henderson was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. Each charge carried the possibility of the death penalty. The case involved extensive psychiatric evaluations. Mental health experts reviewed her history and condition at the time. Prosecutors acknowledged her mental illness but pursued full accountability. In July 2019, a plea agreement was reached. Henderson pleaded guilty to both counts. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from consideration. The court sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences were imposed for each child. She was transferred to state custody following sentencing. This case underscored how quickly a mental health crisis can turn fatal. It also highlighted the limits of welfare checks once deputies leave a scene. The outcome closed the criminal case, but not the broader questions it raised. Darlie Routier. June 6, 1996. Rowlett, Dallas County. Just before dawn, A frantic emergency call shattered the quiet of a suburban Texas street. A mother reported a brutal attack inside her home. Two young boys were bleeding on the living room floor. She claimed an intruder had entered during the night, armed with a knife. By the time police arrived, one child was already dead. The other would not survive long. The mother herself was injured, lying nearby. At first glance, the scene suggested a violent home invasion, but small details did not align cleanly. Blood patterns raised questions. The story began to shift almost immediately. What started as a presumed outside attack would evolve into one of the most disputed cases in Texas criminal history. Darlie Routier was a young mother living in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. Friends described her as energetic, image-conscious, and deeply attached to her children. She enjoyed socializing and maintaining a carefully styled appearance. Her sons, Damon and Devin, were active, playful, and closely bonded. Family photos showed a household that appeared loving and ordinary. Darlie was often seen as protective and expressive with her children. There were no prior reports of abuse. On the surface, this was a typical family home with typical pressures. Nothing outwardly suggested the violence that would unfold inside it. To the outside world, the Routier family looked comfortable and secure. Behind the surface, investigators later pointed to mounting financial strain. The family carried credit card debt and recent insurance changes. The prosecution would argue that lifestyle expectations exceeded resources. Darlie reported feeling stressed and overwhelmed. Her marriage was described as strained but not violent. There was no documented mental illness comparable to psychosis. Instead, the case hinged on motive interpretation. Was this a tragic crime by an unknown intruder? Or was it a calculated act hidden behind a staged narrative? The answers depended entirely on evidence interpretation. The point of no return came when investigators began challenging Darlie's account. Physical evidence conflicted with critical parts of her story. The crime scene was contained within the living room and kitchen area. Both boys had sustained multiple stab wounds consistent with close-range attacks. The injuries were severe and fatal. Darlie had a neck wound and superficial injuries to her arms. Bloodstain patterns showed cast-off near the sink area. A knife was recovered inside the home. There were no clear signs of forced entry. Glass found on the floor appeared disturbed after bloodshed began. The scene suggested movement and cleanup attempts rather than chaos. Investigators noted the controlled nature of the environment. Nothing indicated a hurried escape by an outsider. These findings became central to the prosecution's case. Investigators analyzed blood, spatter, fingerprints, and fiber evidence. Blood patterns indicated activity after the boys were wounded. The sink area showed diluted blood, suggesting washing. No unknown fingerprints were conclusively identified. Neighbors reported hearing no screams or suspicious movement. Security assessments found no credible intruder pathway. Surveillance and neighborhood canvassing produced no suspects. Insurance policies taken out before the murders were examined. Darlie's public behavior, including recorded footage days later, drew scrutiny. Prosecutors framed these actions as inconsistent with grief. The defense argued grief presents differently under shock. The case became a battle of interpretation rather than certainty. In 1997, Darlie Routier was convicted of capital murder. She was sentenced to death. She remains on death row, with appeals ongoing and DNA testing still contested. The case highlights how perception can shape justice. Evidence can be interpreted through competing narratives. Grief, trauma, and guilt do not follow predictable patterns. When certainty is demanded, doubt often becomes the battleground. The truth in this case remains fiercely debated. While doubt defined this investigation, the next case would reveal violence driven by shared delusion and belief. Cynthia Marie Randolph. In May 2017, authorities in Parker County, Texas, responded to a report involving a parked SUV outside a residential home west of Fort Worth. Inside the vehicle, first responders found two toddlers secured in car seats. They were identified as 2-year-old Juliet Ramirez and 16-month-old Kavanaugh Ramirez. Both children were unresponsive at the time of discovery. Paramedics initiated emergency medical procedures immediately. Despite sustained efforts, neither child could be revived. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators began reconstructing the hours leading up to the discovery. Cynthia Marie Randolph had been responsible for caring for the children that day. According to police records, the SUV was parked outside the residence during the afternoon. Temperatures in Parker County were already dangerously high. Investigators learned Randolph exited the vehicle and went inside the house. The children remained strapped into their car seats. No doors were opened and no windows were lowered. Initial questioning revealed Randolph claimed she left them briefly. She told officers she believed the children were safe for a short time. However, detectives quickly identified inconsistencies in her timeline. As interviews continued, her version of events shifted repeatedly. Those contradictions became an early focus of the investigation. The forensic findings provided critical clarity. Medical examiners determined both children died from heat stroke. Their core body temperatures were elevated to lethal levels. Internal findings showed organ failure consistent with prolonged hyperthermia. There was no evidence of blunt force trauma or physical assault. The injuries documented were environmental in nature. Seatbelt impressions confirmed the children remained restrained. Experts testified that temperatures inside a closed SUV rise rapidly. In extreme heat, conditions become fatal within a short period. Investigators concluded the children were confined for several hours. The manner of death was ruled homicide caused by heat exposure. As the investigation deepened, motive and context came under scrutiny. During formal interviews, Randolph offered an unusual explanation. She told detectives she was attempting to teach the children a lesson. She described it as an effort to promote independence and problem-solving. Investigators found no evidence this belief was reasonable or safe. Records indicated Randolph had been using marijuana that day. She admitted to smoking after returning inside the home. She also acknowledged falling asleep for a period of time. Witnesses reported no emergency or interruption that prevented her return. Prosecutors later argued the conduct went beyond poor judgment. They characterized it as a conscious disregard for known risks. The prolonged confinement became central to their theory. Digital and recorded evidence reinforced that assessment. Interrogation footage showed Randolph changing details under questioning. Early statements minimized how long the children were left alone. Later admissions extended that time frame significantly. Phone records showed no calls requesting help during the critical hours. There were no messages expressing concern about the children's condition. Investigators found no attempt to check the vehicle during the afternoon. Neighbor observations supported the extended timeline. The lack of intervention was documented, step by step. Detectives concluded the children were forgotten only after the fact. The case moved into the legal system later that year. Randolph was formally charged with 2 counts of reckless injury to a child. The charges reflected extreme risk rather than intentional homicide. During trial proceedings, medical experts testified about pediatric heat stroke. They explained how rapidly children lose the ability to regulate body temperature. Jurors were shown interrogation footage highlighting inconsistencies. Witnesses described the weather conditions on the day of the deaths. The defense argued there was no intent to cause harm. Prosecutors emphasized awareness, inaction, and prolonged exposure. In 2018, a jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. The judge sentenced Randolph to 2 20-year prison terms. The sentences were ordered to run concurrently. She was transferred into state custody following sentencing. The convictions brought the case to a close in Parker County. While this case centered on reckless conduct and shifting explanations, The next would involve severe mental illness and deliberate actions carried out in secrecy. Amanda Hawkins. In June 2017, authorities in Kerrville, Texas, responded to a parked SUV outside a private residence in the Texas Hill Country. Inside the vehicle, first responders discovered two toddlers strapped into car seats. The children were identified as 2-year-old Addison Overgaard Eddy and 1-year-old Bryn Hawkins. Both were unresponsive when found. Paramedics attempted life-saving measures at the scene. Those efforts were unsuccessful, and both children were pronounced dead. The investigation immediately centered on the events leading up to the discovery. Amanda Hawkins was inside the residence, where a gathering had taken place. Investigators learned the gathering involved alcohol and continued through the evening and overnight. Witnesses told police the children had been placed in the SUV earlier that day. The vehicle remained parked outside, with the doors closed and windows up. As hours passed, outdoor temperatures continued to rise. Several guests noticed the children were not inside the home. According to statements, concerns were raised multiple times. Investigators documented that Hawkins was warned directly. Witnesses recalled her responding dismissively. She reportedly said the children would cry themselves to sleep. No one was permitted to remove them from the vehicle. The SUV remained untouched through the night. By the following morning, the situation had not changed. The vehicle was still parked in the same location. When the children were finally checked, both showed no signs of life. Police were called shortly afterward. Officers secured the scene and began interviews with everyone present. The focus quickly narrowed to Hawkins' actions and decisions. Investigators found no evidence anyone else placed or restrained the children. There were no signs of forced entry or interference with the vehicle. The case was treated as a criminal investigation from the outset. Forensic findings provided a clear cause of death. Medical examiners determined both children died from fatal heat exposure. Their body temperatures were consistent with prolonged confinement in extreme heat. The injuries documented were environmental, not traumatic. There were no defensive wounds or external injuries unrelated to heat. Seatbelt positioning and car seat restraints showed the children never exited the SUV. Investigators reconstructed a timeline approaching 18 hours inside the vehicle. During that period, interior temperatures would have risen to lethal levels. Experts noted young children are especially vulnerable to heat stroke. The deaths were officially ruled homicides caused by heat exposure. Attention then turned to motive and background. Records indicated Hawkins had been drinking during the gathering. Witnesses described a party atmosphere that continued late into the night. Investigators learned Hawkins wanted to avoid the disruption of caring for the children. Statements suggested she prioritized the gathering over their safety. There was no emergency, accident, or misunderstanding involved. The vehicle was functional and easily accessible. Investigators found no evidence Hawkins forgot the children were there. Multiple reminders and warnings were documented. Her responses showed awareness rather than confusion. Prosecutors later argued the conduct reflected a conscious disregard for life. Digital and circumstantial evidence reinforced that conclusion. Cell phone records placed Hawkins at the residence throughout the night. There were no calls for medical help related to the children. No messages indicated concern or attempts to check on them. Witness phones confirmed discussions about the children being left outside. Surveillance from nearby areas showed the SUV was never moved. The absence of any corrective action became central to the case. The legal proceedings followed within the next year. Hawkins was arrested and formally charged. The charges included injury to a child and abandoning or endangering a child. Each count reflected the prolonged nature of the conduct. Prosecutors prepared to present witness testimony and forensic evidence. The case did not proceed to a jury trial. In September 2018, Hawkins entered a guilty plea. She admitted responsibility for both deaths. The court imposed a 40-year prison sentence. 20 years were assessed for each child. The sentences were ordered to run concurrently. The plea spared the families and witnesses a lengthy trial. While neglect and willful indifference defined this case, the next one would reveal how shifting stories and deception shaped a different investigation. Andrea Yates, 2001, Houston, Harris County. The quiet of a suburban morning ended inside a small family home. What happened there would become one of the most disturbing cases in American history. 5 children, all under the age of 8, were found lifeless inside their own house. No stranger had come through the door. The person responsible was someone they trusted completely: their mother. As investigators arrived, the scene raised immediate and unsettling questions. Why would a parent harm her own children? What kind of thinking could justify such an act? In the hours that followed, the case would expose a collision between severe mental illness, religious fear, and the limits of the legal system. It would divide public opinion, reshape conversations about postpartum mental health, and leave behind a tragedy that still defies simple explanation. Andrea Yates was known as a devoted, organized, and deeply religious mother. Friends described her as quiet and reserved, focused on her household and children. Her days were structured around caregiving, homeschooling, and faith. She had 5 children in rapid succession, each one requiring constant attention. To neighbors, she appeared overwhelmed but committed. There were no reports of abuse, neglect, or outward hostility toward her children. Inside the home, routines were strict and predictable. Andrea rarely socialized and kept a narrow daily world. Her identity revolved almost entirely around motherhood. To many, she looked like someone doing her best under heavy pressure. To the outside world, the Yates family appeared stable and disciplined. Behind the surface, Andrea struggled with serious mental illness for years. She had been diagnosed with severe postpartum psychosis and schizophrenia. She experienced hallucinations, delusions, and episodes of deep depression. Doctors warned that additional pregnancies could worsen her condition. Despite these warnings, she continued to have children. Religious beliefs became tightly woven into her illness. She began to believe Satan was targeting her family through her failures as a mother. In her mind, her children were at risk of eternal damnation. Treatment included hospitalizations and medication, but symptoms persisted. Her mental state deteriorated, even as responsibilities increased. The point of no return came after the birth of her youngest child. Andrea's condition sharply declined, and her thoughts became rigid and obsessive. She believed time was running out to protect her children's souls. Inside the home, the acts unfolded without witnesses. Investigators later determined the children were drowned one by one in a bathtub. Each child was subdued through physical force, consistent with drowning. There were no defensive injuries indicating outside involvement. Afterward, the bodies were placed carefully, suggesting deliberate actions rather than panic. Andrea then contacted authorities and her husband. When officers arrived, she did not resist or attempt to flee. She calmly described what she had done. Her statements reflected fixed, delusional beliefs, not confusion. She told police she believed she was saving her children from Satan. The scene showed no evidence of struggle beyond the immediate acts. Everything pointed inward, toward a psychological collapse rather than external threat. The investigation quickly focused on Andrea's mental history. Medical records documented multiple psychiatric hospitalizations before the deaths. Doctors had recorded hallucinations, suicidal thoughts, and religious delusions. Prescription records showed recent changes in medication. Witness statements from family members confirmed ongoing concerns about her stability. There was no evidence of financial gain, abuse history, or third-party involvement. Phone records confirmed Andrea acted alone that morning. Forensic evidence matched her account of events. Prosecutors and defense experts reviewed extensive psychiatric evaluations. The central question became not whether she committed the acts, but why, specifically whether she understood right from wrong at the time. In 2002, Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. That conviction was later overturned due to false expert testimony. In 2006, she was retried and found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state psychiatric hospital, where she remains confined. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable realities. Mental illness can distort love into perceived protection. Trust can collapse quietly, without visible warning signs. The law struggles when intent is shaped by delusion rather than malice. Andrea Yates's actions were real, irreversible, and devastating. Yet they emerged from a mind disconnected from shared reality. The tragedy leaves unresolved questions about responsibility, prevention, and care. While untreated, psychosis shaped this case. The next would center on doubt, denial, and contested truth inside a family home. Deanna Laney, May 11th, 2003. Tyler, Smith County. It was Mother's Day morning when emergency responders were called to a quiet residential street. A neighbor reported a woman standing in her front yard covered in blood. She was holding rocks in her hands. 2 children lay motionless on the ground nearby. A third child was severely injured, but alive. There were no screams for help, no attempt to flee. The mother waited calmly as police arrived. Her words were not panicked or confused. They were deliberate and measured. What followed would reveal a case shaped by religious psychosis, carried out in full view of daylight. Deanna Laney was a mother of 3 young children. She was known in her community as deeply religious and reserved. Friends described her as obedient, soft-spoken, and devoted to her faith. She spent much of her time at home caring for her children. There were no prior reports of abuse or domestic violence. Her children were described as affectionate and trusting. Joshua and Luke were elementary school-aged and active. Aaron, the youngest, was still a toddler. To neighbors, the family appeared quiet and ordinary. Nothing outwardly suggested impending violence. To the outside world, Deanna Laney's faith appeared conventional. Behind the surface, her beliefs had become rigid and absolute. She experienced delusions centered on divine testing and obedience. In her mind, God was communicating directly with her. She believed she was chosen for a trial of faith. Her children, she believed, were part of that test. There was no evidence of anger, resentment, or financial stress. The motive did not involve escape or gain. It was rooted entirely in psychosis shaped by religion. Medical experts would later describe her condition as severe and active. The point of no return came when Deanna believed God demanded proof of obedience. She concluded her children's lives were required as part of that command. The violence occurred in the front yard of the family home. Investigators determined the children were struck repeatedly with large rocks. Joshua and Luke sustained severe head injuries and died at the scene. Aaron was also struck and suffered critical injuries. The attack was sustained rather than impulsive. There was no attempt to conceal the bodies. Neighbors witnessed parts of the aftermath. Deanna did not resist arrest. She made statements indicating she believed the act was righteous. The setting, in open view, underscored her detachment from reality. Investigators documented blood evidence and recovered the rocks used. Medical examinations confirmed cause of death as blunt force trauma. Witness accounts placed Deanna with the children throughout the incident. There was no evidence of another person's involvement. Psychiatric evaluations revealed active religious delusions at the time. Doctors concluded she could not distinguish right from wrong during the act. Phone records and timelines confirmed she acted alone. The investigation focused on mental state rather than criminal planning. No conflicting physical evidence emerged. The case centered entirely on her psychological condition. In 2004, Deanna Laney was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed indefinitely to Rusk State Hospital. She remains under psychiatric supervision. The case underscores how psychosis can override parental instinct. Faith, when distorted by illness, can become lethal. Public settings do not guarantee intervention when belief erases fear. The children were victims of a mind detached from reality. While divine command drove this case, the next would reveal psychosis expressed through ritual and self-inflicted certainty. Cynthia Marie Randolph. In May 2017, authorities in Parker County, Texas, responded to a report involving a parked SUV outside a residential home west of Fort Worth. Inside the vehicle, first responders found two toddlers secured in car seats. They were identified as 2-year-old Juliet Ramirez and 16-month-old Kavanaugh Ramirez. Both children were unresponsive at the time of discovery. Paramedics initiated emergency medical procedures immediately. Despite sustained efforts, neither child could be revived. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators began reconstructing the hours leading up to the discovery. Cynthia Marie Randolph had been responsible for caring for the children that day. According to police records, the SUV was parked outside the residence during the afternoon. Temperatures in Parker County were already dangerously high. Investigators learned Randolph exited the vehicle and went inside the house. The children remained strapped into their car seats. No doors were opened and no windows were lowered. Initial questioning revealed Randolph claimed she left them briefly. She told officers she believed the children were safe for a short time. However, detectives quickly identified inconsistencies in her timeline. As interviews continued, her version of events shifted repeatedly. Those contradictions became an early focus of the investigation. The forensic findings provided critical clarity. Medical examiners determined both children died from heat stroke. Their core body temperatures were elevated to lethal levels. Internal findings showed organ failure consistent with prolonged hyperthermia. There was no evidence of blunt force trauma or physical assault. The injuries documented were environmental in nature. Seatbelt impressions confirmed the children remained restrained. Experts testified that temperatures inside a closed SUV rise rapidly. In extreme heat, conditions become fatal within a short period. Investigators concluded the children were confined for several hours. The manner of death was ruled homicide caused by heat exposure. As the investigation deepened, motive and context came under scrutiny. During formal interviews, Randolph offered an unusual explanation. She told detectives she was attempting to teach the children a lesson. She described it as an effort to promote independence and problem-solving. Investigators found no evidence this belief was reasonable or safe. Records indicated Randolph had been using marijuana that day. She admitted to smoking after returning inside the home. She also acknowledged falling asleep for a period of time. Witnesses reported no emergency or interruption that prevented her return. Prosecutors later argued the conduct went beyond poor judgment. They characterized it as a conscious disregard for known risks. The prolonged confinement became central to their theory. Digital and recorded evidence reinforced that assessment. Interrogation footage showed Randolph changing details under questioning. Early statements minimized how long the children were left alone. Later admissions extended that time frame significantly. Phone records showed no calls requesting help during the critical hours. There were no messages expressing concern about the children's condition. Investigators found no attempt to check the vehicle during the afternoon. Neighbor observations supported the extended timeline. The lack of intervention was documented, step by step. Detectives concluded the children were forgotten only after the fact. The case moved into the legal system later that year. Randolph was formally charged with 2 counts of reckless injury to a child. The charges reflected extreme risk rather than intentional homicide. During trial proceedings, medical experts testified about pediatric heat stroke. They explained how rapidly children lose the ability to regulate body temperature. Jurors were shown interrogation footage highlighting inconsistencies. Witnesses described the weather conditions on the day of the deaths. The defense argued there was no intent to cause harm. Prosecutors emphasized awareness, inaction, and prolonged exposure. In 2018, a jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. The judge sentenced Randolph to 2 20-year prison terms. The sentences were ordered to run concurrently. She was transferred into state custody following sentencing. The convictions brought the case to a close in Parker County. While this case centered on reckless conduct and shifting explanations, the next would involve severe mental illness and deliberate actions carried out in secrecy. Shabora Latrice Thomas. In August 2016, authorities in southeast Houston, Texas, responded to a welfare concern that quickly escalated. First responders were led to a disturbing discovery. 2 children, 7-year-old Aralon Ray Thomas and 5-year-old Kiana Thomas, were missing. A third younger child was found alive. As the search expanded, officers located the bodies of the 2 older children. Both had died before help could arrive. Investigators immediately focused on the mother, Shabora Latrice Thomas. She was present when officers arrived and provided limited information. Her statements were fragmented and difficult to follow. Detectives learned the children had last been seen inside the family home. Attention turned to the bathroom, where signs suggested recent activity. There were indications of water use, inconsistent with normal bathing. Officers secured the residence and began a full search of the area. Neighbors reported unusual behavior earlier that day. Investigators noted delays and omissions in Thomas's initial account. Those inconsistencies prompted a deeper inquiry. The forensic examination established how the children died. Medical examiners determined both Aralon and Kiana drowned. The injuries were consistent with forced submersion. There were no signs of accidental slipping or unsupervised bathing. Investigators documented evidence of a sustained event rather than a momentary lapse. Water patterns and the condition of the bathroom supported that conclusion. The children's bodies were later found concealed. One had been moved from the home. The concealment indicated awareness after the deaths. The manner of death was ruled homicide. As detectives examined motive and background, extensive records emerged. Thomas had a documented history of severe mental illness. Medical records showed diagnoses, including bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. She had also been treated for severe depression. Family members reported previous psychiatric hospitalizations. Witnesses described episodes of paranoia and emotional instability. Investigators learned she had struggled to maintain consistent treatment. Despite this history, prosecutors argued the actions were deliberate. They pointed to the methodical nature of the drownings. They also emphasized the effort to hide the bodies. According to investigators, those steps showed awareness and intent. The surviving child became a critical consideration throughout the case. Digital and circumstantial evidence supported the prosecution's theory. Phone records showed activity after the estimated time of death. There were no emergency calls placed immediately following the incident. Investigators found no attempts to seek medical help for the children. Statements from neighbors placed Thomas moving between locations. The concealment under a nearby crawlspace required time and planning. Detectives argued these actions were inconsistent with confusion alone. The sequence suggested a controlled effort to avoid discovery. The legal process extended over several years. Thomas was charged with capital murder. The charges reflected the deaths of multiple children. The case raised complex questions about mental illness and criminal responsibility. Competency evaluations were conducted during pretrial proceedings. Mental health experts reviewed her medical history. Prosecutors maintained she understood her actions at the time. The defense emphasized her long-standing psychiatric conditions. As trial approached, concerns grew about the impact on the surviving child. Testimony would require reliving the events in detail. In February 2023, the case reached a resolution. Thomas accepted a plea deal offered by prosecutors. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. The capital murder charges were reduced as part of the agreement. The court imposed a 40-year prison sentence. The terms were structured to avoid a prolonged trial. Prosecutors stated the deal was intended to prevent an appeal. It also spared the surviving child from testifying. Thomas was remanded into state custody following sentencing. The plea closed one of the most complex cases in the county. Across these cases, a common thread emerges. Extreme decisions made behind closed doors carried irreversible consequences. Each investigation revealed moments where intervention was possible. Each ended only after lives were permanently changed. Kimberly Dawn Trenor. Spring, 2007, Harris County, Texas. The story begins inside an ordinary home, in an ordinary neighborhood. What unfolded there would not be discovered for weeks. A 2-year-old child vanished without an Amber Alert, without neighbors asking questions. There were no immediate searches, no urgent calls for help. Instead, silence settled in. When answers finally came, they revealed a prolonged pattern of control, punishment, and fear. This was not a sudden outburst. It was a series of choices, repeated behind closed doors, escalating until there was no way back. By the time authorities understood what had happened, a child's life had already been erased, and the person responsible was the one meant to protect her. Riley Ann Sawyers was 2 years old. She was small, dependent, and entirely reliant on the adults around her. Family members later described her as quiet and vulnerable. She was at an age where discipline was guidance, not force. Her daily world revolved around routine, attention, and safety. To the outside world, she was just another toddler growing up in Texas. There were no public warnings, no visible signs that her life was in immediate danger. What happened to her would only become clear after she was already gone. Kimberly Dawn Trenor was Riley's mother. To neighbors and acquaintances, she appeared to be raising her child within a structured household. Behind the surface, discipline was central to daily life. Trenor's partner reportedly believed in harsh corporal punishment. That belief shaped the environment inside the home. What began as discipline slowly crossed into something more severe. The line between correction and harm became blurred. There were no outside interventions before it was too late. No agency stepped in. No one stopped the escalation. Inside the home, control replaced care, and punishment replaced protection. The point of no return came when discipline was no longer about behavior. It became about power. At that moment, restraint disappeared, and the child's safety no longer mattered. Investigators later pieced together what happened through admissions and forensic findings. Riley suffered multiple injuries over time. She was struck repeatedly with belts. She was subjected to prolonged physical punishment. At one point, her head was held underwater, restricting her ability to breathe. She was also thrown with enough force to cause skull fractures. These were not accidental injuries. They reflected sustained trauma. After Riley died, there was no call for emergency help. Instead, her body was transported away from the home. It was eventually discarded in Galveston Bay. The effort to conceal her death only deepened the severity of the crime. The investigation began when Riley's disappearance raised alarms. Authorities followed timelines, statements, and inconsistencies. Physical evidence revealed the extent of her injuries. Medical findings confirmed repeated trauma, rather than a single event. Investigators examined movements, locations, and disposal patterns. Trenor's account failed to align with forensic conclusions. The condition of the body provided clarity where words did not. Witness statements and background information established the household environment. Together, the evidence showed a pattern of abuse that escalated over time. There was no support for an accidental death. The case moved quickly once the facts were established. In 2009, Kimberly Dawn Trenor was convicted of capital murder. The court determined the crime met the highest threshold under Texas law. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no future release, no second chance. The case raised lasting questions about discipline, accountability, and isolation. It showed how extreme beliefs can normalize harm when unchecked. It highlighted how abuse can remain hidden in plain sight. Most of all, it exposed the vulnerability of children who cannot speak for themselves. Riley Ann Sawyers never had a chance to escape her circumstances. While unchecked discipline and control defined this case, the next would reveal how domestic conflict can erupt into sudden, irreversible violence. Dana Schlosser, November 22, 2004, Plano, Collin County. Police were dispatched to an apartment after a disturbing emergency call. Inside, officers found a mother holding an infant. The child was critically injured. The mother was calm, seated on the floor. She was singing religious hymns. There was no attempt to hide what had happened. The injuries were immediately life-threatening. Despite emergency treatment, the infant did not survive. From the first moments, it was clear this was not a case of panic or accident. It was a deliberate act, guided by belief rather than impulse. The scene would become one of the most haunting examples of postpartum psychosis in modern criminal history. Dana Schlosser was a young mother living with her husband and infant daughter. Friends described her as intelligent, deeply religious, and private. She had recently given birth and was struggling emotionally. Her daughter, Margaret Elizabeth Schlosser, was 10 months old. Family members described Dina as loving, but increasingly withdrawn. She spent long periods isolated inside the home. There were no prior reports of abuse or neglect. To those around her, she appeared overwhelmed but devoted. Few recognized the severity of her mental decline. To the outside world, Dina's behavior seemed rooted in faith. Behind the surface, she was experiencing severe postpartum psychosis. She reported hearing voices she believed were from God. These voices gave her instructions. Her religious beliefs became rigid and absolute. She believed obedience was required without question. Medical experts later described her thinking as detached from reality. There was no evidence of anger toward her child. There was no attempt to gain or escape responsibility. The motive was entirely internal, shaped by delusion and illness. The point of no return came when Dana believed God commanded her to act. She concluded that harming her child was an act of obedience. Inside the apartment, the violence occurred in isolation. Investigators determined the infant's arms were severed using a kitchen knife. The injuries were immediately catastrophic. Dana did not seek to conceal the act. She remained with her child afterward. When police arrived, she was singing hymns and praying. She made statements indicating she believed she had done what was required. There was no resistance during arrest. The scene showed no signs of struggle or outside involvement. Everything pointed to a single, deliberate act driven by psychosis. Investigators collected the knife used in the attack. Blood evidence confirmed the location and sequence of events. Medical examinations established the cause of death as traumatic injury. There were no defensive wounds or indications of another person present. Psychiatric evaluations documented active hallucinations and delusions. Doctors confirmed she was unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time. Witness statements from family described a rapid mental decline after childbirth. There was no conflicting forensic evidence. The investigation centered on mental state rather than intent to kill. In 2006, Dana Schlosser was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state mental hospital. She was later released, then recommitted, following continued psychiatric concerns. This case reflects how untreated postpartum psychosis can become catastrophic. Faith, when filtered through illness, can override maternal instinct. The tragedy underscores the consequences of missed intervention. It leaves lasting questions about recognition, responsibility, and prevention. While psychosis shaped every case so far, the broader pattern reveals how belief, stress, and isolation repeatedly turn inward, with irreversible consequences.